Hello, welcome to the Taichi Notebook podcast. I'm your host, Graham Barlow, and this is the podcast for everything I find interesting in martial arts. My guest this episode is Matthew Kreuger, who hails all the way from sunny Alaska, where he runs his own podcast called Walking with the Tengu, which explores classic texts and writings for the modern martial artist. Matthew is a fellow practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and also practices the Japanese sword art of Iaido and the Chinese throwing art of Shuai Jiao. We get on to how Matthew combines these three arts together in his personal practice later, and we think you'll find it pretty interesting. Today, our main topic of discussion is warriorship and what it means to be a warrior in the modern world, or not, as the case may be. But first, we start off with the topic of performance in martial arts. This is inspired by my recent trip to a pro wrestling event over here in Bristol, where I took my son to watch Total Chaos, which is a local wrestling promotion, and it was great fun. So, let's get into it now. Here he is, Matthew Kreuger. Hi Matthew, how's it going?
It's going wonderful. Thank you for setting this all up. It's, I know, very early for you and quite late for me, but...
Not too bad, it's 7:30ish.
Oh, okay.
I'm okay, it's alright.
Good.
But you're way over there in Alaska, aren't you?
Yes, up here in Alaska, which when you think about what a time we live in, where, two martial artists on opposite sides of the world can have this conversation, it's an incredible time to be alive.
Yeah, it is. So last night I went to my first pro wrestling event with my son.
How was that?
It was awesome. It was really good. This is Total Chaos in Bristol. I'll be writing about that soon, I think, because it's a martial art. It is a martial art. It's just very blatant about its showbiz potential, Whereas I think a lot of other martial arts, especially Chinese ones, pretend that there is no performance side at all. Well, obviously performing. Which
Yes.
which
Well,
has always fascinated me. I don't know what you think about that.
It's an interesting topic. You had Paul Bowman in this case. I've been following his work for years now, and I don't remember the exact one, but it may have been Ben Judkins who also works with him in that area, martial arts studies. But, they've talked about the performative aspect of the martial arts, the entertainment aspect to it, and there's always been, you go back to pre-modern eras, and the transition into the modern era, both in Japan and in China, and I would argue in various Western countries, also had a entertainment aspect to it. I have a very old photo, I believe from France, which has plastered across the top of it, it says Jiu-Jitsu, and it looks like, 1910, possibly late 1800s circus performers doing nothing related to Jiu-Jitsu. The transition, the entertainment value of it, I think impacts all martial arts. I mean, look at judo in the Olympics. You're talking about pro wrestling. You look at pro wrestling where it was 100 years ago, and it was a little different than it is now.
Yeah, it was. Exactly. I mean, I was thinking the other day that in our jiu-jitsu academy, we bow to the photos on the wall of the masters, and it's the Gracie family, and then it goes back to Count Koma. I mean, Count Koma is a wrestling name. It just sounds like the Baron or something, doesn't it? And he used to go around and do sort of fighting the locals at fun fairs type events.
Right.
And in Victorian England, we had tours of Japanese jiu-jitsu fighters putting on demonstrations in theatres in the Victorian age. I mean, that is the origin of jiu-jitsu, really, if you think about it. But
Yes.
But these days, if you try and say it's something to do with pro wrestling, people get very sort of funny about it and like, oh, that's nonsense. It's all made up.
Well, it's become clownish at this point. I say that in all due respect to it, of course. It is entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to the outsider, it can appear comical. And we have seen, plenty of people transition from that arena into, let's say, acting.
Yeah.
And so, there is definitely a physical aspect to it. There's great strength and stamina and agility and flexibility needed to do it. And yet there's also a theater aspect to it as well. And so in a sense, there's a cross-diversity to being able to function as a member of that world that I would suspect most people find pretty challenging.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I've been talking to Scott Phillips. He's a rather controversial character in martial arts, but he made the very good point that a lot of the skills required for acting are the ones required for self-defense, because you hear serious martial artists talk all the time about how self-defense isn't a bunch of techniques, it's a mindset, and it's a way of interacting with somebody. And I mean, what is acting? It's a mindset and a way of interacting with somebody. You know, you
Sure.
take on a persona, you act, you use sleight of hand, deceit. All these things are part and parcel of the self-defense world. Anyway, we're getting very off topic. I
We
didn't want to
are.
talk about this. Go on.
And that's okay. I mean, just to tie it back, that performative aspect might be practical in the sense of de-escalation. There's a certain amount of acting that needs to go into dealing with a high-stress emotional situation and maintain your cool and behave in a way meant to influence that situation towards an end that you find to be positive. So there could be some real self-defense value to this as well.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think there is. There is. It's just not having a narrow focus, I think, with your opinions and your vision of what things are. But anyway, you run a podcast, which we have to talk about first, and that's Walking with the Tengu. Now, this is a brilliant podcast. To me, you're looking at classic texts that aren't necessarily martial arts texts, but are part of the whole world that martial arts came out of. Do you want to just talk about your podcast and what you're aiming to do there?
Sure. And I just want to say I've been listening to you for years, and I appreciate your kind words. It means a lot. You've had a number of fairly famous individuals on your podcast that I've listened to, so I feel a little imposter syndrome getting to talk about that. But yes, the podcast came out of a series of events back in the ancient days before social media. There were these things called forums. And I recall one day after writing up a long post about history and linguistics and the use of the term jujitsu, both in Japanese and then in late 19th century English and then 20th century English, it occurred to me that this could be turned into a paper. So I wrote a paper, posted it on academia.edu, and then let it sit for a few years. And I kept getting responses to it and thinking about it, and it occurred to me that there was a kind of an intersection there that could be explored. But what ended up happening was there was a quote that I had heard over the years, which is widely misattributed to Thucydides, which is, "A nation that draws too broad a difference between its scholars and its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools." The actual quote is from Sir William Francis Butler, and is a little more wordy than the one that gets thrown around, but I like it too, which is, "The nation that will insist on drawing a broad line of demarcation between the fighting man and the thinking man is liable to find its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards." And it occurred to me that a lot of the martial arts that I had been exposed to were focused on how to do violence, but not why or when. So the third event that occurred was I was reading this work called The Demon Sermon of the Martial Arts. And as I was reading it, there was discussions about sports versus self-defense training and various topics that I see people arguing about online today. And, this work is from 400 years ago. And it occurred to me that the things people were talking about 4 centuries ago is very little, if not different at all, from what we're talking about today.
Yeah, it still goes on.
Yeah, and really a lot of it, I recall reading some of it and thinking, this is literally what people are saying today. In a completely different time, completely different culture, and thus a very, very different worldview, and yet the topics, the principles under discussion really haven't changed a whole lot. And I would even argue that the relationship with violence that people had back then was perhaps different than what we have today. At least if you live in a first world nation, we have a certain amount of stability that perhaps those coming out of the Sengoku era did not have in medieval Japan. And yet these discussions weren't all that different. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I started to take notes, and I thought, well, why don't I turn these notes into a discussion, basically a monologue, and thus the podcast was born, which was just, there's stuff that people have been talking about for centuries, and I don't think the problems have really changed all that much. Our relationship with violence, how we mediate that, how we handle it. And so I thought it'd be interesting to try to take these classical works and try to relate it to our modern era. And here we are.
Yeah, I mean, your scope is vast because you do a lot of Japanese things, a lot of Japanese writing, a bit of Chinese stuff, but also you take in the Greeks as well, don't you? And that kind of warrior culture they had.
Yeah, I plan to hit the Icelandic sagas. There's a couple Indian epics that I'd like to hit as well. One of the earliest references to the idea of a just war, justum bellum in the Latin, is, I forget the name of it, but is in an Indian epic where they, two semi-deities discuss whether it's moral to use a certain weapon against one's enemies. And these are, discussions we have today. Is it moral and ethical to use certain weapons against others? So.
Yeah, it's Geneva Convention stuff, isn't it?
And that was, if I recall correctly, this epic is over 4,000 years old now. So, somebody was thinking about it a long time ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that we've just been regurgitating the same old stuff over and over to do with human conflict for thousands of years and not really getting anywhere.
Yeah.
So, one word you mentioned there was the W word, the warriorship word. Now, Randall Davis from Kung Fu Conversations, he's been trying to get a bunch of us podcasters together to talk about warriorship. And I was initially reticent to talk about that at all, and I didn't really want to be part of the project. But then I heard your most recent episode where you had a long discussion on warriorship with the guy from New Zealand whose name suddenly escapes me. You'll have to fill that in.
It's okay, yeah. Dean Suter from the Musha Shugyo podcast.
Yeah, so just to backtrack, I have a problem with the concept of warriorship applied to martial artists. It just kind of, there's something about it that I don't like, especially in the jiu-jitsu world. Because you do jiu-jitsu as well, don't you? And you've been doing it for like 10 years longer than me. So you're an old hand at this business.
Let me just caveat that with that. I did take an 8-year break in there.
Okay.
I am probably not as far as long as I could be. So.
Okay, right, all right, yeah. The old 8-year break, yeah. Well, normally having kids is the thing that does that, isn't it?
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah, there you go. I knew it. In the jiu-jitsu world, we're full of... I mean, the internet side of jiu-jitsu is huge. The social media about it, the YouTube clips about it, people showing techniques. I mean, it's fascinating culture. But part of that seems to be this sort of sharing of memes about lions and wolves and samurai. They threw me to the wolves and I came back the leader of the pack, and if you want to train with lions you have to do lion stuff, and
right.
and pictures of samurai with a modern jiu-jitsu logo on them somewhere, and I just find this whole idea of people thinking they're warriors when they go to dress up in pajamas and go to a class 3 times a week a little bit distasteful to real warriors who we still have today, who's done 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan or something. I mean, the idea of me telling somebody like that I'm a warrior, I would find a little bit embarrassing.
Sure.
And there's another side to it, which is in the run-up to this Second World War, the Japanese government used that whole Budo culture of being a samurai as a recruitment tool to inspire nationalism and pride in their past as a way to get people to go and join the army and drop bombs on people. And I find that easily manipulated side to that culture, again, something I'm wary of and don't want to get involved in.
Sure, yeah.
So I don't know what you think about those two things.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a reason the American occupation forces banned the practice of Japanese martial arts after taking over Japan.
Yeah.
Um, I always like to bring up the fact that karate was not banned because it was not Japanese, it was Okinawan. But, and it's probably why there were so many Americans that brought karate back to the U.S. after World War II. But, judo, kendo, those two in particular, there were other ones as well. But, aikido was banned as well. But all the typical, what we would call Japanese budo, were banned because of its connection to the nationalistic brainwashing that it was used for. And I seem to recall, I can't quote the source, but this is one of the things that Jigoro Kano fought against leading up to the imperial military era, and may have, his connection to the education system in Meiji Japan, and his, pushback against that militarism may have been led to his, suspected poisoning. But either way, whether or not he was actually poisoned, it's not provable. He died, and thus, judo and kendo in particular were co-opted into this, like you said, brainwashing program. And, I kind of alluded to it in the conversation with Dean, but there is a necessity to convince people that it's okay to go kill those people over there, that those people are bad, and that it's okay to use lethal force to end their lives. So I think your hesitancy is warranted, and I think it's worth talking about and thinking about this, because at the end of the day, if we as martial artists traffic in the interaction of violence, then there is a concentric sphere that overlaps with those who go out and do war. That's another thing that I have, in this warriorship conversation, have thought a bit about is, the definition to me of a warrior in its most basic sense is someone who goes and does war, whereas that is not necessarily someone who is, let's say, a guardian or a defender. Both may do violence, but one is like a active, going out and actively doing something, versus one is meeting violence that's coming in. And not everyone, of course, agrees on that definition, but at least one sense of linguistics, I think there's a difference there. And maybe that's a little bit at the heart of what you're getting at. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, warriors go to war. That's it. And I looked at the definition of warrior on the internet, and it said an experienced soldier. So it wasn't just somebody who went to war. It was somebody who'd kind of seen a battle or two, or been through the mill a bit. It was I think the idea was on older, more experienced Meiji warrior.
Sure.
But either way, I have martial artist friends who call themselves warriors, and it really bugs me because I don't think they are, and I would never call myself a warrior. I just don't feel comfortable with that. Whether it's a modern warrior or a peaceful warrior, it's still got the word warrior in, and it just rubs me the wrong way, and I don't like it.
I can't remember where it was. It was some jiu-jitsu forum somewhere. It may have been Facebook. I may have seen on Reddit. I don't remember now. But exactly what you were talking about. There was someone who posted, I've got a screenshot somewhere, who's like, no, you're not a Viking. You're not a samurai. You're not a gladiator. You do pajama wrestling. Get over yourself.
Exactly.
And, I see it in my own gym where there are a certain amount of people who kind of take that persona that you've described, and I'm like, I'm just here to have fun. I'm not.
Yeah.
So as an example, I take issue when someone describes a jiu-jitsu match as a fight. It's not a fight. It's pajama wrestling.
That's another thing, isn't it? But then again, do you call an MMA match a fight?
I get why they do. It's certainly closer to what I would describe as a fight, but it's also not a fight in the sense, we didn't talk about it here yet, but I do have a background in law enforcement, and a very brief one, but I did experience violence in that context as well, and that's closer to what I would describe as a fight.
Yeah, I mean, to me, if you started calling yourself a warrior, I wouldn't have an issue with that because you've actually done some warrior shit,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas,
Sure.
I mean, people that, the MMA one's difficult because at the end of some matches of MMA, people are just sort of, they're completely exhausted, covered in blood, and and the commentator says something like they've been through a war, and it kind of is true, but equally it's still a sport, and they can stop any time they want,
Right.
so
Yeah.
it's not a fight in that sense, is it?
Yeah. And you don't see the same kinds of, I would say, moral and ethical conundrums that you see in actual. Again, I've not actually been on a battlefield, but from what I understand of the way we interact with death and pain and suffering is different when you viscerally experience it.
Mm.
So, I haven't actually seen anyone die on a battlefield, but I've held people as they died, as they died violently. So, in that regard, there's something there that you don't experience, I think, in a match. And that's where I typically end up with, jiu-jitsu or MMA, because they are all expressions. If we think of violence as a pie, as a pie graph, it's,
Mm.
jiu-jitsu is a slice of that pie. MMA is a slice of that pie. There's a little bit of overlap there. I would argue that most martial arts are a slice of that pie, but none of them encompass all of it, because a schoolyard bullying situation is not the same as a riot or a gang fight or a battlefield. And so each of these are different expressions of violence. And so when someone talks about doing something in, I'm using air quotes there for those listening, the street, well, the context matters, because what a soldier faces in a low intensity conflict is different from what someone's experiencing in a ring or on the street or a drunk uncle at a wedding or a road rage incident. I mean, we can come up with so many different variations for violence that it's challenging to try to narrow any of these down as representative of the entire pie. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I was talking to Paul Bowen about violence in
Mm-hmm.
jiu-jitsu, because we were just commenting that what we do is inherently violent. It's really violent, but nobody thinks about it as being violent when you're doing it, because your identity is
Mm-hmm.
different. You go into like a safe room with mats on the floor. You're all wearing a different uniform. You've kind of stripped away your sense of self in a way, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
personal
Mm-hmm.
at all. And somehow violence doesn't seem to be an issue or really a factor in what you're doing, or what you're thinking about when you're doing jiu-jitsu. But yet, if you stop to think about all the things you are doing would kill somebody. I mean, there's there's no
Sure.
other way to think about it.
Well,
So it's an interesting
it
conundrum in
is.
martial arts, how we think about violence, but it's almost we look away from it while sort of acknowledging
Mm-hmm.
its
Yeah.
presence.
Think about the new white belt that comes in. It's their first class. They don't know what's going on. They've never experienced this before. Maybe they're not used to the closeness of it. There's a certain amount of
Yeah.
closeness in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that is different than other things that people typically do. And so, you see how a brand new person comes in and interacts with that situation. And I suspect there's a lack of comfort there that once you get used to it, because you're right, once you're in there, once this is a safe place, um, a known place, it's not so bad. Yeah, you're getting smothered. Yeah, it's
Mm.
uncomfortable, but none of us typically feel like our life is actually in danger. The stress that comes from feeling like you may die or be seriously physically injured is not a normal part of the practice. Um, I mean, sure, it still happens, and that's where it's on the edge of it. But I think this kind of gets at the heart of what you're saying, which is like I understand why people misattribute it towards warriorship, as it's dipping its toe towards that direction. But you're right, it's not. Martial artists can be warriors, but are not by the nature of simply doing the martial arts, do not necessarily become warriors, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's fair. That's fair. Yeah. Anyway, that was why I kind of I didn't want to talk about it. Now we've just talked about it, so I have talked about it. So there you go.
Well, it's
But you helped me have that conversation. I think because you had a very sensible conversation on your last podcast about warriorship, and I thought, okay, yeah, there's something in this that we could have a conversation about. So that's good.
So, if I understand you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, your definition of the word warrior primarily links then to a military definition. Would that be fair?
Yeah, but I'd also incorporate law enforcement into people who've seen
Sure.
action. I think I don't have a problem with those type of people being warriors.
Perhaps then it's those that move towards violence as opposed to moving away from violence?
Maybe, but I think there's still a military
Okay.
component to the way I think about it as well. That it involves war, and the people that go to war or have been to war.
So what about other first responders, such as like a firefighter or an EMT?
Well, I used to teach a firefighter. Used to teach Tai Chi to him, and he'd never been in physical. Well, maybe he had been in physical altercations, but he never really talked about them. But he would talk about trauma and having held somebody's brain in in his hands. As he scooped them up off the floor from a traffic accident or something. Those sort of. He'd talk about things like that. So he was kind of reliving trauma occasionally. I don't know if I'd think of him as a warrior, though. I mean, people who have serious medical conditions, they have a battle with whatever it is, say cancer. They quite often get called warriors, and I wouldn't like to tell those people they're not if they choose to use that word, because they're living through something or have lived through something that most people will never experience and could never imagine. So it's a grey area, I guess.
Well, and this is, I think, what makes this conversation so interesting is because there are certainly, Randall did an episode about a couple of people who had challenging physical ailments and how they overcame them, and he was talking about how they're for him, a definition of a meeting that definition of a warrior. Meanwhile, Dean cited a study from the Naval Academy on characteristics that, word associations of relating to the characteristics of a warrior that were very different from that. And so, kind of getting back to some of Paul Bowman's work and Ben Judkins is this idea, and entertainment, is the fact that our perceptions of what a warrior is, particularly, I think, in first world nations, has been influenced by entertainment, by movies, by television, by video games, and so I think this is partly where, in the jiu-jitsu community, when people think about a warrior, that's, they think about the samurai, they think about the Viking, or, the Spartan, or whatever, because that's our representations of warriors that they have been exposed to, as opposed to individuals who have actually experienced a battlefield.
Good old Tom Cruise has got a lot to answer for with The Last Samurai, hasn't he?
That he does.
When you look at the historical samurai, most of them who lived through the Tokugawa period were glorified tax collectors, really. I mean, they didn't actually fight in battles for... There was a good 400 years where there were no battles because it was a period of peace.
Right.
And the samurai class basically just collected taxes off people and beat them up if they wouldn't give them the taxes. So having that tattooed on your arm, I find... really a sort of a weird concoction, but like you say, it's because of films, it's because of our culture and our perception of what a samurai is these days, I think. Sure.
Well, I mean, let's think about the Chinese martial arts for a moment. During the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a shift. I have a number of older Shuai Jiao manuals where, from the 1912 era, where they are equating using Shuai Jiao for nationalistic purposes in the same way that Kano was using judo in Japan, right? I don't think they cite Kano. I think they just cite Japan and talk about judo and we have this Shuai Jiao and we need to use it for the same reasons.
Well, that would be that period. They really looked towards Japan as the answer to their problems in 1912. That was everything from Japan was great, and they sent lots of people over there to learn their ways so they could also become a nation that had an empire,
Kano actually sponsored a school specifically for Chinese students to come over, and I believe it was to focus on learning education, so they could teach in the modern sense of the word, and there was an adjacent judo school to that some of them participated in. But I mean, the perception in the Chinese martial arts we've talked about from an entertainment standpoint, the classical stories like The Water Margin, Journey to the West, there were perceptions of the martial arts in those. All the stories that grew up around the Shaolin and whether they did or did not do certain things. There were perceptions within the culture prior to the modern era that shaped the way that people perceive the martial arts. I mean, to this day, I have a wife who was born in Taiwan, and her parents are very, very culturally Chinese. And their perception of the martial arts is that gangsters and stupid people do the martial arts. So, and
I think that's every wife I've ever known's perception of what their husband does when it comes to martial arts. Why are you doing that thing? It's a waste of time.
Well, I am blessed with a wife that actually participates in this with me, and so we have a family where everyone does it. I know that's rare.
Yeah, it's very rare.
So, but culturally, at least in my experience in Taiwan, is that it's not necessarily seen as a thing that respectable people do. Now, again, we go back 100 years. We look at people like Sun Lutong, and then, of course, Ip Man with Wing Chun. There was an attempt with both of them to bring a certain amount of respectability to the martial arts, to Gong Fu.
I have ums and ahs. You carry on. I've got ums and ahs
It's
on
okay.
that point.
It's okay. My understanding is that Ip Man primarily taught upper class, whereas, for example, like Hungar primarily taught lower class individuals.
Yeah, and Choi Fut was the big rival to Wing Chun.
Right. Yeah.
And that was a working man's martial art, and then you had the middle class.
Right. So let's tie that to Brazil for a moment. The Gracies taught richer people. Capoeira survived in the favelas. So there was a class distinction in Brazil back in the 1920s, well, that's too early, 1930s, 1940s, within the martial arts. And so the perception, again, of how the public views what violence is impacts how they interact with the martial arts. I joke that we do South American ground karate because people don't really understand. I mean, you do what? I can't tell you how many people have been like, "Oh, you do jiu-jitsu," and they make like hand chops.
Yeah.
We've all had those.
I believe the phrase is Mexican ground karate.
That works too. Yeah. So, and I get a certain amount of that too. I see that in some of the in the past. The perceptions, the performers in Hong Kong who did martial arts, who made careers in the entertainment industry, predated the ones that we know. I mean, Jackie Chan is the most obvious one. Sammo Hung is another. But, they came out of the opera scene, the Cantonese opera scene. And yet, they would fall under my definition of martial artists. But they're not warriors, and that's no discredit to them. They're hard workers, they're incredible martial artists, but are they warriors? I don't think most people would typically think of Bruce Lee, Sammo Hung, Jackie Chan, Jet Li as being warriors. And that's, again, I'm not discrediting them. They're different.
Yeah. My Tai Chi lineage and Kung Fu lineage comes out of Hong Kong. So my teacher my teacher's teacher came from Hong Kong to Britain in 1979, maybe early 80s, something like that. But my teacher will always remember that he was much more interested in being a doctor than a martial artist, because a martial artist was a low-level person, like you're saying. They belonged to a low-level class, and there was no respectability in it. Like, his parents wouldn't think it was respectable to be a martial artist, but if he could be a doctor, like a Chinese medicine doctor, I think he specialised in bone setting. There's a word for it, but I've forgotten it. Anyway, it was basically the bone setting side of things. But
Sure.
he did everything, like massage and herbalism and everything. So he once he got to Britain, he got here and the Kung Fu boom was just dying off. So he thought it was going to carry on. So he trained a load of people like my teacher to win martial arts competitions. So he trained them intensively in the fighty stuff, And then the boom just disappeared, and it all became about healing and everything, which he just kind of switched to being a sort of Chinese doctor, because
Sure.
in his culture that was much more respectable anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was something that you could tell people, and they'd be proud of you, you know.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that meant a lot. A martial artist, like you say, it belonged to a lower class. It wasn't a respectable profession to be involved in, really.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but like you say, the other reason to mention him is that as part of the martial arts tradition, he carried on this teaching or tradition. It translated into English as Way of the Warrior.
Hmm.
And it was a mindset training thing. Sifu Ran, my teacher, would say that he would have these long conversations with Lam Sifu about this Way of the Warrior concept. And so it has the word warrior in it, but it was like a morality training, and it was to do with when you would use martial arts on somebody.
Right.
It was long and involved, and there was a lot to it, but I think if we just said what was the essence of what they were talking about, it was basically, in the moment, you try and be as aware as possible and have all the facts of the situation, and you make your decision, and then you just live with it. Like, you don't go back and try and redo it. It was kind of like a moving forward in a way that would ease your conscience, because you've known you've made the best decision you could possibly at that time.
Right. Yeah.
So that was quite an interesting. I mean, I guess if you relate that back to people fighting on battlefields, they have to make their decision in the moment, and they can't go back and redo it, and then they have to live with it. So I think a lot of it was about how you'd live with the consequences of doing violence. So that was quite interesting.
And that really gets at the heart of, well, two things. First, what you just described is basically I had a class on that in the police academy. You know, how do you make choices and then live with yourself after? Because sometimes your choices means... the classic example from the class is that there's a burning building, and there's a kid on one end of the building and a kid on the other. You probably heard this one recently. And you can only save one kid. And if you take too long, they both die. So save one. But by choosing one, you're consigning the other to death. And how do you live with yourself knowing that you chose this person to live and this person to die? You know, it comes up in triage when dealing with a mass casualty event or an event with a lot of people dying. Is how do you need to prioritize your resources. So if you can save 100 people by letting these other ones die, then by letting 5 of them die, then that is that a better economical choice than saving 5 and letting those other 100 die? And yet, how do you choose one person's life over another? So it's very curious that sort of training was in your lineage, because that is one of the key failings I have experienced in the martial arts, which gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is we all train how to do violence, but I don't see a lot of talk about why and when to do violence. And I see some of that in the older martial arts, in the older texts. And I see some of that in what people would call traditional martial arts. There are some of those discussions, and I think we need more of that today in the air quotes modern martial arts.
Yeah, I mean, to jump back into the modern world of jiu-jitsu, there's a lot of teaching kids about anti-bullying. But when we get to the adult classes, that whole aspect is just not considered. But then again, it depends on your academy. Is it a self-defense type academy, or is it a sport jiu-jitsu type academy? I mean, if you're talking sport jiu-jitsu, then ideas of morality and using violence on the street would never even come up. But those techniques you're learning are potentially lethal, and you're not getting any training in like the when you use them, as opposed to the why.
Right. I mean, competition is, in the non-malicious sense of the word, effectively amoral. There's just no moral content. You either win or you don't. And I suppose there's a certain amount of you need to not care about hurting the other person, because you got to try so hard to get that medal. I mean, you look at ADCC or any of the big jiu-jitsu competitions, and you need to not really care about the other person. I mean, you're not trying to kill them, but if they happen to get injured in the process, so be it. So I guess there is a certain amount of ethics in there, but it's not like what we're talking about. So competitive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is effectively amoral, and that there isn't a moral content to what you're doing. Whereas, when we talk about self-defense, there is a moral content to that. Are you justified in what you're doing in the application of violence to another individual? Are you not? Can you live with yourself if you do violence and this person dies or is severely injured? So, like you said, what kind of academy are you training at? Well, it makes a difference. But on the other hand, while I know jiu-jitsu can be practiced as a martial art, I find it typically is practiced as a sport, at least amongst the academies that I've experienced. I know of ones out there that do have a martial arts component to it. But there's a reason why I hear the word gym thrown around and coach. You go to the gym, you got training from your coach, because large swaths of the jiu-jitsu community effectively just practice it as a sport. And I don't mean that in any sort of negative sense. I enjoy doing that myself. But I also recognize that that's not, we both have practiced Chinese martial arts. I got something more out of that than what I was getting out of jiu-jitsu. I love jiu-jitsu. I'm never going to quit it. But I don't get the same things out of jiu-jitsu that I got out of other martial arts. And that's why I cross-train in other things. Because I'm not finding, at least in the choices I have in my locale, I don't have the ability to train jiu-jitsu as a martial art with other people. I can do it myself, of course.
Yeah, so where I'm training, it's a Gracie Barra school, which is it's squarely in the middle of everything. So it's if you had the Venn diagram of sport and self-defense and lifestyle and I don't know, stick another one in to do with jiu-jitsu, athletic performance or fitness or something. The Gracie Barra company. I think you could call it a company.
That's fair.
They hit right in the middle. So it's jiu-jitsu for everyone. So it's a little bit of everything. So we do, like on our basics classes, we always start with a stand-up, and it's normally a self-defense type, like somebody throws a punch and you do a hip throw. Then the next technique will be something on the ground, and then something on the ground, and then sparring. But there's always a self-defense component, and I find myself gravitating so much more away from that. Probably because I've been doing it for 10 years,
Sure.
But I just find the self-defense stuff can't keep my interest long term. I think it's interesting, but for me, it's a short-term thing. You kind of go, oh, okay, I now know how to do that. Good. What's next? And what's next for me is the sports side, essentially, because there's an almost infinite depth to the way you can challenge yourself in sport in jiu-jitsu. I mean, I run out of things I want to do in self-defense very quickly.
Right.
I don't know about you.
At the end of the day, it's simple. There's not that much complexity to it. And so I like to say that people walk in the door typically because they want self-defense, but they stay because it's fun. So, it's great that we can use our skills in a way that can make ourselves more confident and be able to handle potentially conflict in healthier ways. But at the end of the day, we stay because it's fun. And that's because we like the people we're with. And so, this idea that you can only have like a combative warrior martial art, we don't interact with our martial arts in that way at this time. Maybe if we lived in a culture that was more constantly at war, we would have to interact with it in that way, because not doing that would result in us dying quicker. But for most of it, it's a hobby. There are certainly in law enforcement, there are people who use their skills in their job, but most of us don't use martial arts in our job. Not at least in the physical sense. I certainly can see, we see this in the jiu-jitsu community as well. I think we see it in other martial arts too, where, again, the mental aspect of it, if you mentally face challenges and maintain your calm and can overcome them, that has applications in other areas of life. I also practice Iaido for all those sword fights I get into, which is so far 0.
Tell me about that, because I've got a friend who practices, I don't know if it's Iaido or something like it, but he puts on, like a Japanese suit and waves a sword around in his back garden. And I do wonder what the hell he's doing and why he's doing it.
Right, right.
Can you
Yeah,
can you
yeah.
explain why would you want to do that, and what do you get out of it?
So this is a very good question, because there are, as you have probably seen in other martial arts, there is a wide range of different levels of quality in the practice of a martial art. So if you had someone that had taken a few classes at a jiu-jitsu school and then went off with his friends and just did backyard jiu-jitsu for the next 10 years, I don't think they would be a fair representation of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful, particularly when it comes to pretending to be a warrior, which I think ties into our conversation today. There are representations in entertainment that people fall in love with and that they want to pretend that they are doing. There's an author called Ellis Amder in the classical Japanese martial arts world who has often described it as masturbatory cosplay, where people just want to dress up like a samurai and wave a sword around. And for some people, that's all they're looking for. Okay. So why do I do Iaido? Well, as I mentioned, at least the way that I interact with jiu-jitsu today, it's mostly as a combat sport. I love it. I've used it in real life against people who actually want to kill me. It's a useful tool on my tool belt. But as I also mentioned, there are elements to my own journey that it does not provide for, and that includes how we interact with violence and how we develop ourselves into individuals who are better capable of dealing with that. So what I find with the Iaido is that it is actually closest to my firearms training. Target selection, mental focus, awareness of what's around you. So, we can get into all these esoteric Japanese words like zanshin or mushin, awareness of what's around you, not allowing your emotions to control your thoughts. There's a lot of physiological things that occur when you're in a high-stress combative situation, such as tunnel vision or tachypsychia, which is the distortion of the perception of time. And while you can never perfectly simulate those things in training, there are ways to simulate slices of them. And so when you have perhaps you have someone that is of a larger weight class than you, sitting on you perhaps in side mount, and just putting all their weight into you, and suddenly you can't breathe, and you've been there for the last 3 minutes, there is a mental fortitude that comes with not just giving up and tapping. And so while it is not a direct application to a warrior experience, the ability to train yourself to continue when it feels like you're going to, like the suffering is never going to end, is absolutely you're able to take that mental skill and reapply it in a far worse situation later. Or at least you'll be better prepared for it if you've had it in small amounts over a long period of time. You might think of like stress inoculation, where you have small amounts of stress that desensitize you or prepare you for dealing with large amounts of stress. And so, Iaido ends up being, for me, kind of more of the mental side of things. It's challenging, I think, for people who haven't experienced it before to truly understand why would dressing up in these weird clothes, waving a sword around, have any impact on anything. And quite frankly, it's no different than my firearms training. We had to inculcate physical behaviors in drawing the weapon from the holster, acquiring the target, and then applying violence to the target. The only difference really is that in Iaido, you have to generate the kinetic force, whereas in firearms training, the gun provides the kinetic force. So there's a certain amount of physical control that goes into Iaido, where the nuance of it, you have to control your body in ways that you don't have to in firearms training. But the irony of it all is that I find constant crossover between how I'm using my body in jiu-jitsu and how I'm using it in Iaido. The amount of, perhaps you've seen the knee walking in Japanese martial arts, commonly called shiko. Perhaps you can think of some ways in jiu-jitsu where moving around someone perhaps in knee on belly, or transitioning around to north-south and then back into side mount. The way you use your hips and the way you move your knees, I have found massive amounts of usefulness in just shiko, this weird Japanese knee walking and sitting to apply on the ground in a grappling context. And so the flexibility and the strength that I get from that is one of those crossover areas.
Yeah.
So, but if I was going to, that's kind of rambling on. The too long didn't read version of it is it trains my mind in a way that I'm not getting from jiu-jitsu. So
I think the knee walking stuff is probably like a side benefit, but to me it sounds like it's the mental focus that is taking time to train the mental focus as something separate. Because obviously in all martial arts there's mental focus, but if you take a lot of the other stuff out, so that there's only the mental focus left, then it's just a different way of training, isn't it? And I can see the benefits there.
yeah, I think one of the things I forgot to mention is that there's also a focus on efficiency of movement, which comes up in jiu-jitsu as well. But
yeah, it does. Yeah.
one of the things I struggle with in Iaido is learning simple things like walking with efficiency, turning with efficiency, using my upper body in a way that generates force without using my muscles too much.
Yeah.
For people who have chopped wood before, there's a way to use the wood splitter, the axe, that is more efficient than just swinging your arms. You'll wear yourself out if you just use your muscles over and over again. And it's those little things where learning to move efficiently come up as well. So,
Damn it, I've got interested in Iaido now.
yeah, right. In all our spare time, if I had all the time in the world, there's so many more martial arts I would take.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the one that I wish I'd carried on with was capoeira. I did like about 3 lessons, loved it.
Yeah.
But I think at that point my wife said, "You're doing too many martial arts now. You have to stop one of them."
there is too much. And for people that are listening, really it comes down to what's in your area. What do you have access to? I happen to have a diamond in the rough here in Alaska. There's someone who's well known in the Iaido world, highly ranked, and so it just made sense to train with him. So not everyone's going to have that.
The other martial art that you do that I wanted to really ask you about was Shuai Jiao. Or Shuai Jiao?
Shuai Jiao.
I never get the pronunciation.
That's
one
okay.
of them means sleepy time or something, and the other one means the martial art.
Yeah. So I don't know if it'll come across in the podcast, but this actually came up because we speak Chinese in my home, and I was getting it wrong because my pronunciation is the worst of everyone here. My 4-year-old corrects my pronunciation. But Shuai Jiao is a type of dumpling.
Right.
Shuai Jiao is the wrestling. And if I'm tired and I want to go Shuai Jiao, that's where I want to go sleep. So the tonal difference is what makes the difference. So
why did you start to get interested in Shuai Jiao when you're already so deep into other martial arts?
Right.
To me, it's in the judo world. It's what you do when you're young and flexible and can bounce off the ground on your head without suffering any ill consequences.
Right.
And
right.
basically, as you get older, those things seem like a really bad idea. But you seem to have started it later in your martial arts career than earlier.
You're absolutely right. And it comes out of the fact that jiu-jitsu people tend to be really bad at throws and takedowns. I wanted to improve that. And about 6 years ago, I got thrown really badly, threw my back out, spent most of the last 6 years rehabbing it. I had been to the doctor. They couldn't find any kind of bone or joint issue, so they were convinced it was soft tissue. They even tested for like weird blood diseases that could be causing it. But basically, every time I rolled, it would feel like my hip went out of joint, and there was just massive pain. I couldn't, if I sat down on the toilet, I couldn't get back up again. It was bad. Ooh. And I am not the only jiu-jitsu person who has had a bad takedown result in an injury. So looking at that, and perhaps drawing a little bit on classical Stoic philosophy, the idea that the obstacle is the way, I was like, well, I need to really start looking into why this happened and how it can be done. Because people don't typically, people don't typically do things that wreck their body, but here we are in jiu-jitsu where everyone that's been doing it for a certain period of time has joint issues and muscle issues.
At least one surgery.
Yes. But there are ways to train it safely. And so I started looking around at what was available. No one does Greco-Roman wrestling past 30. I've had people tell me that the best grappling art is, Greco-Roman wrestling. You should go do that. I'm like, great. Where's a 40-year-old dad going to find some place to train that? So it doesn't matter how good it is. There's no one to train to do that. It doesn't make sense. So, going back to this idea of a violence pie, the way that you get good at something is by taking other things away. If you want to get really good at striking, go train boxing. You really want to get good at wrestling, go train jiu-jitsu. There's no striking. I mean, limited striking, but generally no one's training striking in jiu-jitsu. If you want to get really good at throws, go train one of the martial arts that focuses on that. Classically, in the jiu-jitsu world, it's judo. But given my interaction in the Chinese world, I was like, well, you know what? I go to Taiwan every so often. Let's do Shuai Jiao. Because at the end of the day, and I know some people would hate to hear this, is they're not that different. Yes, the jacket has shorter sleeves. Yes, they have different principles and different training methodologies they emphasize. But at the end of the day, it's jacket wrestling. And that obviously applies in jiu-jitsu as well. And nice thing about Shuai Jiao, it also has no jacket wrestling. So the school that I'm working with, which is there's a man called Sunny Manon in California. There's a school called Guangwu Shuai Jiao. Has online classes. And you think, okay, you can't learn throwing from online classes, and you're right. But with dedicated training partners who also are interested in throwing, you can take his lessons and work together, and he provides feedback, and you can send him videos, and you can work together. And so every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I start our jiu-jitsu classes off with a Shuai Jiao warm-up is what we like to call it. But it results in, learning the details of a throw, practicing it on each other, and then applying it in a competitive, non-cooperative situation. And so
nice.
It complements the jiu-jitsu. It allows me to... My Chinese in-laws are a little bit happier that I'm doing something that has a Chinese element to it. And
some cultural. That's nice.
Right. Well, and that's the problem. You get back to nationalism. Even today, we have not extracted nationalism from the martial arts. There is a national pride to it to a certain degree. And I find that heavily in the Chinese communities that I interact with. But that's beside the point. So that's why I do Shuai Jiao now.
I mean, that's amazing. So you're teaching the jiu-jitsu classes, and you're integrating Shuai Jiao into the first bit of it. The warm up and the stand up section.
So my teacher allows me to integrate Shuai Jiao into the beginning of the jiu-jitsu class.
Nice. Well, that's great.
I might fill in once in a while, but I'm not nearly good enough at jiu-jitsu to be teaching just yet. So
right. Okay.
Yeah. So
I've never heard of a jiu-jitsu school that has a Shuai Jiao stand-up component. So this is quite unique.
Well, so I started at Gracie Baja School as well, and we had judo on Saturdays, and
Right.
the academy I train at now also had a judo component on Saturdays. Until about 2-3 years ago, there was a change of ownership. Classes changed. We no longer had a judo instructor. He ended up going to a different school. So it was like, well, now we had a gap. We got an MMA program. We have our jiu-jitsu program. We used to kind of have Muay Thai, but not so much anymore. So it's like, well, this is an area I need. And since I was recovering from this injury... Oh, and I do want to say, the practice of the solo techniques in Shuai Jiao. So they have various body strengthening, flexibility, and agility exercises that are done. 100% rehab my back. I spent about 4 years managing the pain with yoga, and that worked. I had been to the doctors, I had gotten x-rays, I had gotten, physical therapy advice from them, but at the end of the day, it was basically yoga that was just managing the pain. About 2 years ago, I started this Shuai Jiao, and I noticed during particularly their hip exercises, they have ones called Chong Yao, Fan Yao. Yao is kind of like the core and waist. They don't really have a word in English that quite matches with it, but
yeah, we use that word it's in the Tai Chi classics, Yao, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's all these exercises: Xiao Xuan Yao, Xuan Yao, Fan Yao, Chang Yao. Chang Yao is like lengthening the waist. I would get these clicks in my hip, and one day there was a pop, and everything felt better.
That what you're describing sounds like an SI joint thing to me.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you read my blog recently, but I popped my SI joint out, and it was Chinese exercises that put it back in, and there was like a pop, like you said.
Yeah, I do Bado and Jin as well. I seem to recall your article was about Bado and Jin specifically.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
I forget which one it's called in Chinese, but the one where you're like wagging your head back and forth.
Yeah.
That one, I would get the same clicking as I was going back and forth. So, yeah, at the end of the day, it helped my back as well. And so it's been about 2 years now where I can roll in jiu-jitsu without fear of my hip going out.
Wow.
I no longer fear throws. I had a former wrestler do a takedown on me, and I didn't feel like I was in danger. I mean, it was a rough takedown, but I've been able to build myself back up using Shuai Jiao, not be afraid of throws, learn how to be comfortable standing, and integrate it with jiu-jitsu. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. You'll have to tell me how that goes in the future, because I'd love to see a developed group of students who are using Shuai Jiao, like see some of those throws pulled off in a competition. Like if you can teach enough people that it integrates into the competition scene, it'd be great to watch.
At the end of the day, when you get right into it, it's not all that different than any other kind of jacket wrestling. It's really, I know it's different than judo, but the way it integrates, there's plenty of judo people that make it work in jiu-jitsu, and it's fundamentally the same thing. You could say they're like,
yeah.
I was going to say close cousins, but I don't want to suggest that they're related necessarily, but they function the same way.
No, I think its origins lie in the Mongol wrestling, really.
Yes.
Which isn't connected to judo at all, really. But like you say, that they exist in the same space.
Right.
I mean, there's only so many ways to hip throw somebody,
Yeah, their hip throw, Ru, is the same as I learned a hip throw in judo. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid I could feel like I could talk to you for hours, but we're going to have to round things off because my computer's going to run out of battery.
Sounds good.
That's the one downside of my mobile recording studio, also my car, is that I can't charge my computers.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. So.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm really happy that we got to talk about all the things I want to talk about. We did warriorship, philosophy, and your other martial arts as well, so that's great.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'd recommend everyone checks out your Walking with the Tengu podcast for more philosophical insights.
Thank you for joining us. You can find out more about the Tai Chi Notebook podcast at www.thetaichinotebook.com. You can support us by becoming a patron. Head over to patreon.com/Tai Chi Notebook. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll tune in next time. Bye!